My husband's proud back once turned against me, straight and untouchable. Then a wreck bent it. Now he clings to me, the wife he broke, as the only thing keeping him alive. He doesn't know it yet, but this time, I decide how the story ends. What happens when the person who crushed your soul becomes completely dependent on you for survival? When the one who made you feel worthless suddenly needs you more than their next breath? I'm about to tell you a story that will make you question everything you know about power, revenge, and justice. A story about how sometimes, life has a way of evening the score in the most unexpected ways. But before we dive in, if you believe that everyone gets what they deserve eventually, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds. My name is Beatrice Washington, and for 15 years, I lived in a marriage that felt more like a prison sentence. I was 40 years old, staring into the mirror at a stranger. A woman who once had dreams that stretched farther than the horizon. A woman who laughed freely, without asking for permission. A woman who believed she mattered. But somewhere along the line, those dreams suffocated under layers of criticism, control, and carefully measured cruelty. My husband, Thaddeus, was what people called a successful man. Real estate mogul. Community pillar. The kind of man who commanded respect when he walked into a room. He had that presence, you know? Broad shoulders, perfectly pressed suits, and a smile that could charm investors out of millions. But behind closed doors. That's where the real Thaddeus lived. I remember the exact moment I realized I had become invisible in my own marriage. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 years into our union. I had spent hours preparing his favorite meal, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables. I was excited to share some news with him about a part-time teaching position I'd been offered at the local community college. He walked through that door like he owned the world, loosened his tie, and sat down without even looking at me. I served his plate, poured his wine, and sat across from him with nervous excitement bubbling in my chest. "Thaddeus, I have some wonderful news to share." He held up his hand without raising his eyes from his phone. "Not now, Beatrice. I'm reading something important." 20 minutes passed. 20 minutes of watching him scroll through emails while his dinner grew cold. When I finally spoke up again, he looked at me like I was an interruption to his real life. "What could you possibly have to tell me that's more important than this merger I'm working on?" That's when it hit me. I wasn't a partner in this marriage. I was furniture. Expensive, well-maintained furniture that he expected to function perfectly without acknowledgement. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, invisible in your own relationship, drop a comment and let me know. You're not alone in this. The teaching job? He crushed it with surgical precision. "We don't need the money, and I won't have my wife working some menial job. What would people think?" That became his favorite weapon. What would people think? He wielded public perception like a sword, cutting down every attempt I made to exist as more than his shadow. When I suggested we start a family, he reminded me that children would interfere with his business obligations and social commitments. When I wanted to visit my sister in Portland, he suddenly had 3 important events that required my presence as the beautiful, supportive wife. The worst part wasn't the big rejections. It was the daily erosion. The way he would correct my grammar in front of guests. How he'd change the radio station without asking if I was enjoying the music. The way he'd invite people over without telling me, then act annoyed when I wasn't prepared. I became a ghost in my own home, moving silently through rooms, anticipating his needs, avoiding his moods, shrinking smaller and smaller until I wondered if I might disappear completely. But you know what they say about ghosts? Sometimes they stick around because they have unfinished business. October 15th. I'll never forget that date because it's when my life split into before and after. Thaddeus had been at another one of his business dinners. The kind where successful men gather to make deals and feel important while their wives smile prettily and say nothing substantial. I wasn't invited to this one. Apparently, it was just the boys. I was actually relieved. I'd spent the evening reading, something I rarely got to do without judgment. There's something sacred about a quiet house and a good book when you've been starved for intellectual stimulation. Around 11:30 p.m., my phone rang. "Mrs. Washington. This is Mercy General Hospital. Your husband has been in an automobile accident. The world tilted. Despite everything, despite the years of feeling small and unimportant, he was still my husband. Part of me, the part that remembered falling in love with his confidence and ambition 15 years ago, felt genuine terror. I threw on clothes and drove through empty streets with my heart hammering. At the hospital, they led me through sterile corridors to the trauma unit where Thaddeus lay connected to machines that beeped and hummed like mechanical prayers. The doctor, Dr. Yanez, was gentle but direct. The impact compressed 3 vertebrae in his lower back. We've stabilized him, but the damage is significant. He'll likely face permanent mobility issues and chronic pain. I stared at my husband, this man who had strutted through life like he owned every room he entered, now looking small and fragile under white sheets. His face, even in unconsciousness, held that familiar stern expression, but his body told a different story. For the first time in 15 years, Thaddeus Washington looked vulnerable. The next few days were a blur of medical terms, insurance paperwork, and concerned visitors who came to see the great man brought low. His business partner, Garrett, paced the hospital corridors making urgent phone calls. His mother, Vivienne, flew in from Charleston, all dramatic sighs and pearl-clutching. But as the days turned into weeks, something interesting happened. The visitors stopped coming. Garrett's phone calls became less frequent. Vivienne returned to Charleston after declaring the hospital atmosphere too depressing for someone of her constitution. The business associates who had once competed for Thaddeus's attention suddenly had pressing matters elsewhere. And then there was me. I was there for every doctor's visit, every physical therapy session, every moment when he woke up confused and in pain. I was the one who learned how to operate the mechanical bed, who memorized his medication schedule, who held the cup while he struggled to drink water. When Thaddeus finally came home, reality hit us both like a freight train. Our house, with its grand staircase and elevated bedroom, had become an obstacle course. I watched him struggle with the simplest tasks, getting dressed, reaching items from high shelves, getting in and out of his chair. This man who had once moved through the world like he owned it now moved like the world was trying to defeat him. And in those first few weeks, something shifted in our dynamic that I don't think either of us fully understood at first. He needed me. Not wanted. Not preferred. Needed. For every meal, every pill, every moment when pain overwhelmed him and he couldn't remember why he was fighting to get better. The man who had spent 15 years making me feel dependent on him was now completely dependent on me. You know what's funny about power? We spend so much time thinking about it as something loud and obvious, shouting, demanding, controlling. But real power is quiet. It's being the person someone can't live without, whether they like it or not. I discovered this on a rainy Thursday morning, about 6 weeks after the accident. Thaddeus was having what the doctors called a challenging day. The pain was worse, his mobility more limited, and his mood. Well, let's just say 15 years of marriage hadn't prepared me for this level of helplessness-induced rage. He'd been trying to reach a book on our coffee table for 20 minutes, too proud to ask for help but clearly struggling. I sat in the kitchen, watching through the doorway, sipping my coffee and waiting. This was new for me, the waiting. The watching. For years, I would have rushed to help before he even realized he needed it. But something had changed in me during those hospital weeks. Maybe it was seeing all his powerful friends disappear. Maybe it was realizing that I was the only constant in his life. Or maybe it was just that I'd finally learned the value of timing. When he finally called my name, not demanded, not ordered, but actually called with a note of defeat in his voice, I felt something I hadn't experienced in our entire marriage. Choice. I could go help him immediately, or I could finish my coffee first. Such a small thing, but it felt revolutionary. I finished my coffee. When I finally walked into the living room, he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or frustration or even pain. It was fear. Fear that I might not help him. Fear that the one person left in his corner might decide to walk away. The book, he said quietly. Could you, please? Please. In 15 years of marriage, I could count on one hand the number of times he'd said please to me. I handed him the book, and our eyes met. In that moment, We both understood something had fundamentally changed between us. He was no longer the man who commanded, and I was no longer the woman who automatically obeyed. The weeks that followed revealed the full scope of this reversal. Thaddeus, who had once criticized my cooking, now ate gratefully whatever I prepared. He who had once changed the channel without asking now requested permission to watch his preferred programs. Most tellingly, he who had once dismissed my thoughts and opinions now hung on every word, desperate for conversation with the only person who stayed. But here's what he didn't understand. I wasn't staying out of love or duty or even pity. I was staying because, for the first time in our marriage, I was exactly where I wanted to be. I controlled his comfort. I decided his schedule. I determined his social interactions. When friends called, the few who still bothered, I was the gatekeeper who decided whether he was feeling up to visitors that day. And slowly, carefully, I began to use that power. Not cruelly. Not obviously. But deliberately. Some days, I was the perfect, attentive wife, anticipating his needs, making his favorite meals, creating an atmosphere of warmth and care. Those were the days when he would relax, smile genuinely, and sometimes even thank me for staying. Other days, I was efficient but distant. I provided exactly what was necessary for his health and safety, but nothing extra. No conversation, no comfort, no warmth. Those were the days when he would watch me with growing anxiety, afraid to ask for more but clearly wanting it. I was teaching him something he had never learned in our marriage: uncertainty. The same uncertainty I had lived with for 15 years, never knowing if my efforts would be appreciated or dismissed, never knowing if I would be treated with kindness or contempt. Now he was the one walking on eggshells, trying to read my mood, hoping for approval. The most profound change happened about 3 months after he came home. I was helping him with his evening medication when he grabbed my wrist, not forcefully, but desperately. "Beatrice, you know I appreciate everything you're doing. I know this isn't easy." I looked down at his hand on my wrist, remembering all the times he had grabbed me in anger, in control, in dismissal. Now his grip was weak, pleading. "I know," I said simply, and gently removed his hand. He searched my face for something, reassurance, perhaps, or a promise that I would keep caring for him. But I had learned the power of withholding certainty. I had learned the strength that comes from keeping people guessing about your intentions. That night, as I helped him settle into bed, he asked the question that had been building between us for months. "You're not going to leave me, are you?" The same man who had once made me feel like I should be grateful he allowed me to stay was now terrified I might choose to go. I tucked his blankets around him, turned off his bedside lamp, and paused in the doorway. "That depends," I said quietly, "on whether you give me a reason to stay." I left him in the darkness with that thought, and for the first time in our marriage, I went to sleep feeling powerful. You might think this story is about revenge. You might assume I became bitter and cruel, that I used his vulnerability to hurt him the way he had hurt me. But you'd be wrong. This story is about something far more sophisticated than revenge. This is about re-education. If you're invested in finding out how Beatrice completely transformed her marriage, hit that subscribe button and let's continue this journey together. See, I had 15 years to study Thaddeus Washington. 15 years to understand exactly what motivated him, what scared him, and most importantly, what he valued most. And what he valued most wasn't money or success or even power. It was control. Control over his environment, his image, his narrative. He needed to be the author of his own story, the director of his own life. The accident had stolen that from him, but I realized I could give it back, selectively, strategically, and always on my terms. I became a master of psychological calibration. On days when he was particularly difficult, demanding, condescending, trying to slip back into old patterns of behavior, I would become unavailable. Not dramatically, not with explanations or arguments. I would simply have errands to run or appointments to keep. I would leave him with everything he needed for safety, but nothing extra for comfort. On days when he showed genuine appreciation, when he spoke to me like an equal, when he remembered to say please and thank you, I would create an atmosphere of warmth. His favorite coffee in the morning, engaging conversation over meals, maybe even a movie we could watch together in the evening. I was training him, though he never realized it. I was conditioning him to associate respect with reward, dismissal with withdrawal. The most brilliant part was that he began to monitor his own behavior. I would catch him stopping mid-sentence when he started to speak to me in the old commanding tone. I would see him hesitate before making demands, calculating whether his approach might result in my disappearing for several hours. He was learning to need my approval, my presence, my good mood. For the first time in our marriage, my emotional state had become important to his quality of life. But the real strategy went deeper than daily management. During those early weeks when he was in and out of medical facilities, I had gained access to things that had been forbidden to me for 15 years. His office, his files, his business communications. As his medical power of attorney and the person managing his affairs during his recovery, I had legitimate access to everything. And what I discovered was fascinating. Thaddeus's business empire, while impressive on paper, was far more fragile than anyone knew. He had leveraged properties, taken on significant debt, and made promises to investors that required constant performance to maintain. His success was real, but it was also precarious, like a house of cards that required constant attention to keep standing. More interesting were the personal files. Evidence of affairs I had suspected but never confirmed. Financial arrangements I had never been told about. Legal documents that affected my future but had been signed without my knowledge or consent. And then there were the letters. Oh, the letters. Correspondence with business partners that revealed exactly what he thought of me. Email threads with his lawyer discussing how to protect assets in case the marriage doesn't work out. Messages to his brother describing me as useful but not essential to his life. I read every single one, filing away information like a detective building a case. Not for divorce court or public humiliation, but for something far more satisfying. Drop a comment if you think you know where this is heading. Trust me, you don't see what's coming next. 6 months after the accident, Thaddeus had regained some mobility. He could move around the house with a walker, drive short distances, and even return to work part-time. His doctors were pleased with his progress, and he was beginning to believe he might return to something resembling his old life. That's when I implemented phase 2 of my strategy. I started volunteering. At first, it was just a few hours a week at the local literacy center. Nothing threatening, nothing that interfered with his care or needs. But it represented something that had been absent from our marriage for years, a life outside of him. He noticed immediately. Where are you going? How long will you be gone? Can't someone else handle that? The same man who had once forbidden me to work was now anxious about me having any commitments that didn't revolve around him. He had become accustomed to my constant availability, and even a few hours of absence created noticeable distress. But I was careful never to neglect his actual needs. His medications were always perfectly organized. His appointments were never missed. His physical comfort was maintained. I wasn't abandoning my responsibilities, I was expanding beyond them. And with each expansion, his dependence became more apparent. One evening, I returned from the literacy center to find him sitting in his chair, staring at the door. He had been home alone for exactly 3 hours, something that would have been meaningless to him before the accident. But now, 3 hours felt like abandonment. How was your day? I asked pleasantly, removing my coat and hanging it in the closet. Long, he said quietly. Very long. Did you eat lunch? I wasn't hungry. But I knew the truth. He hadn't eaten because opening packages and preparing food from his chair was difficult, and he was too proud to admit he needed help with something so basic. He had spent 3 hours hungry rather than ask our neighbor for assistance, waiting for me to return and restore his world to working order. This was when I realized the full scope of what was happening. Thaddeus wasn't just physically dependent on me, he was emotionally dependent on me. I had become not just his caregiver, but his entire social world, his source of interaction, his connection to feeling human. The man who had once made me feel isolated and alone was now experiencing that isolation himself, and I was his only lifeline. That night, as I prepared his evening medication, he asked a question that revealed everything. Beatrice, are you happy? I stopped what I was doing and looked at him. In 15 years of marriage, he had never once asked me if I was happy. He had never considered my happiness a factor worth considering. Why do you ask? I want to make sure you're happy. Here. With me. The vulnerability in his voice was real, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I'm content, I said carefully. I'm finding purpose in my work, meaning in helping others. I feel useful. The word useful hit him like a physical blow. I could see him remembering his own words, his own dismissive attitude toward my value in our marriage. You've always been useful, he said quickly. Essential. I couldn't manage without you. I know, I replied simply. That's what makes me content. And in that moment, he understood something that would keep him awake for many nights to come. I wasn't staying because I loved him or because I was trapped. I was staying because I had power, and I was finally in a position to use it. Before we get to the most intense part of this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to decide between forgiveness and justice? Where someone who hurt you deeply was suddenly at your mercy? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. 8 months after the accident, Thaddeus received news that would have destroyed the old version of himself and served as the perfect opportunity for me to reveal just how much I had learned during his recovery. Garrett, his business partner, requested an urgent meeting. Something about complications with the Henderson project and investor concerns. Thaddeus asked me to drive him to the office, his first time back since the accident. I helped him navigate the building he had once commanded, watching as former employees and associates struggled with how to interact with this diminished version of the man they had once feared and respected. Some were genuinely compassionate. Others were clearly calculating how his reduced capacity might affect their own positions. But the meeting with Garrett revealed something much worse than office politics. During Thaddeus's absence, 3 major clients had withdrawn their contracts. Not because of his accident, but because of financial irregularities that had come to light during the transition of responsibilities. Projects had been overpromised and underfunded. Deadlines had been missed. Penalties were mounting. More devastating still, Garrett had discovered that several key properties were about to go into foreclosure. Loans that had been juggled and refinanced for years were coming due, and the company no longer had the cash flow to manage them. The Henderson project alone could bankrupt us, Garrett explained, spreading documents across the conference table. We need to liquidate assets immediately, and even then, we're looking at significant losses. I sat quietly in the corner, watching my husband's face as his empire crumbled before his eyes. This man who had built his identity around success and control was learning that both were far more fragile than he had ever imagined. But here's what neither Thaddeus nor Garrett knew. I had seen this coming months ago. Remember those files I had access to during his hospitalization? I had spent hours analyzing his business structure, understanding the risks, recognizing the warning signs. I had even consulted with a financial advisor, discreetly, of course, to better understand the implications. And I had made some decisions of my own. That evening, as Thaddeus sat in his chair staring at the financial documents Garrett had given him, I brought him his usual evening tea and sat across from him. It's bad, isn't it? I said gently. He looked up at me with eyes that held the same fear I had seen during those first weeks in the hospital. We could lose everything, Beatrice. The house, the investments, maybe even face legal action if the penalties pile up. What does Garrett suggest? Selling assets, filing for bankruptcy protection, trying to negotiate with creditors. But it means admitting failure, admitting that everything I built was unsustainable. He winced at the word. I thought I was being smart, leveraging opportunities, maximizing potential. I never thought. You never thought you might not be in control long enough to manage it all. He stared at me for a long moment. There was something in my tone that he couldn't quite identify, something that made him pay attention in a way he hadn't in 15 years of marriage. Beatrice, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. If we lose everything, if we have to start over with nothing, would you still stay? It was the question I had been waiting for. The moment when everything I had learned, everything I had planned, would finally serve its purpose. I stood up and walked to our home office, the office that had been forbidden to me for 15 years. I returned with a folder that I placed on the coffee table between us. Before I answer that question, I think you should see this. He opened the folder, and I watched his face change as he processed what he was looking at. Bank statements, investment records, legal documents, all in my name. I don't understand. Remember when you were in the hospital, and I was managing your affairs? I had power of attorney, access to all the business records, insight into everything you had hidden from me for 15 years. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. Beatrice, what did you do? I learned. I researched. I consulted with professionals. And I made some adjustments to protect what I thought was worth protecting. The documents showed a carefully executed plan that had been in motion for months. Using my legal authority during his incapacitation, I had quietly liquidated certain assets, redirected funds, and established accounts in my own name. Everything I had done was completely legal. I had consulted with lawyers to make sure of that, but it represented a massive shift in our financial reality. The house is now in my name. I used your power of attorney to transfer the deed before the creditors could claim it. The retirement accounts. I protected half of them by moving funds to accounts that can't be touched by business creditors. My mother's jewelry collection. Safe in a deposit box that only I can access. He stared at me as if seeing a stranger. Which, in many ways, he was. You've been planning this, he said slowly. All this time, while I thought you were just caring for me. I was caring for myself, I replied calmly. For the first time in 15 years, I was protecting my own interests. But why? If you were planning to leave me anyway, why stay? Why go through all of this? This was the moment I had been building toward for 8 months. The moment when I could finally answer the question that had been burning in my heart since the night he came home from the hospital. Because I wanted you to understand what it feels like to need someone who might not need you back. The silence that followed was profound. I could see him processing not just the financial implications, but the emotional ones. Everything he thought he knew about our marriage, about my motivations, about my capacity for strategic thinking, was being rewritten. So what happens now? He asked quietly. That depends, I said, echoing the words I had spoken months earlier. On whether you can learn to be the kind of husband worth staying with. If you've made it this far in the story, I know you're wondering how this all ends. Before I reveal the final twist, make sure you're subscribed because stories like this, stories about real people facing impossible choices, are what this channel is all about. The conversation that followed lasted until dawn. For the first time in our marriage, Thaddeus and I had a completely honest discussion about who we were, what we wanted, and what we were willing to change. Not the superficial conversations we'd had before, where he dictated terms and I accepted them, but a real negotiation between equals. He was forced to confront the reality of his behavior during our marriage. Not because I demanded an apology, though he offered several, but because his survival now depended on understanding why his wife had felt compelled to protect herself so thoroughly. I made you feel worthless, he said at one point, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, you did. And now you're making me feel human. I suggested. Dependent. Uncertain. Welcome to marriage as I experienced it. But here's what surprised both of us. The conversation wasn't entirely bitter. There were moments of genuine connection, instances where I remembered why I had fallen in love with him originally, glimpses of the man he might have been if he hadn't been so consumed with maintaining power and control. And there were moments when he seemed to truly see me for the first time. Not as an extension of himself or a reflection of his success, but as a separate person with my own thoughts, needs, and capabilities. What you did, he said as the sun began to rise, protecting the assets, planning ahead, managing everything, it was brilliant. I never gave you credit for being that smart. You never gave me the opportunity to show you how smart I was. No, he agreed. I didn't. That morning marked the beginning of what I can only describe as a completely different marriage. Not a return to what we had been, but an evolution into something we had never been: partners. Comment below if you believe people can really change, or if you think Thaddeus was just adapting to survive. The business situation resolved itself over the following months. Some assets were lost, some debts were negotiated, and the empire that Thaddeus had built was significantly reduced but not destroyed. He learned to operate with less leverage, more caution, and, most importantly, with input from someone whose judgment he had finally learned to respect. My role in saving what could be saved was undeniable. The assets I had protected became the foundation for rebuilding. The strategic thinking I had demonstrated during his crisis became an ongoing part of business planning. For the first time in 15 years, I had a voice in decisions that affected our future. But the real transformation was more personal. Thaddeus began including me in social situations not as an ornament but as a participant. He started asking for my opinions on everything from investment opportunities to weekend plans. Most significantly, he stopped making decisions about our life without consulting me first. The volunteering I had started during his recovery expanded into part-time work, then into a full consulting practice helping other families navigate crisis situations. I had discovered skills I never knew I possessed and found meaning in work that felt genuinely important. Our physical relationship even changed. The man who had once expected my availability whenever he desired it now approached me with consideration, asking rather than assuming, creating space for my preferences and desires. But perhaps the most profound change was in how we handled conflict. Arguments became discussions. Disagreements became negotiations. The power dynamics that had once made our marriage feel like a dictatorship evolved into something much more democratic. I won't pretend it was perfect. There were setbacks, moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves, times when we both slipped back into familiar roles. But we had both learned too much to go back completely. Thaddeus had learned what it felt like to be vulnerable and dependent. I had learned what it felt like to be powerful and respected. Neither of us wanted to give up what we had gained. 2 years after the accident, we were having dinner at our favorite restaurant when he said something that surprised me. "I'm grateful for the accident." I looked up from my meal, startled. That's a strange thing to say. I know how it sounds, but think about it. Without the accident, I would have kept treating you terribly. You would have eventually left, maybe not for years, but eventually. We would have destroyed each other slowly instead of rebuilding together quickly. And now I'm married to someone I actually respect. Someone whose strength I depend on rather than someone whose weakness I exploited. It's a much better marriage. He wasn't wrong. The marriage we had after his recovery was infinitely better than what we'd had before. But it was also built on a foundation that he would never fully understand. I had achieved something most people only dream of. Complete reversal of power in a relationship that had once diminished me. Not through cruelty or abandonment, but through strategic patience and careful planning. The man who had once made me feel worthless now depended on my worth for his very survival. The man who had once controlled every aspect of our relationship now lived in constant awareness that I could choose to leave at any time. The man who had once dismissed my intelligence now sought my counsel on every major decision. But here's the real twist in this story, the part that even I didn't see coming. I chose to stay not because I was trapped or because I loved him or even because I enjoyed the power I now held. I stayed because I had finally become the person I was always meant to be, and that person was strong enough to be generous with her strength. Before I end this story, I want you to hit that subscribe button if you believe that sometimes the best revenge is becoming so powerful that revenge becomes unnecessary. 3 years have passed since that October night when everything changed. Thaddeus still walks with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the accident that broke more than just his back. But he's regained most of his mobility and much of his professional success. More importantly, he's learned to carry himself differently in the world. Less arrogance, more humility. Less commanding, more collaborative. The accident didn't just change his body, it changed his character in ways that I don't think would have been possible under any other circumstances. Our marriage isn't a fairy tale. We're not suddenly madly in love or living in perfect harmony. But we're partners now in a way we never were before. We're two people who understand each other's capacity for both weakness and strength, and we've learned to build our relationship around respect rather than control. People sometimes ask me if I regret staying with him, if I think he deserved my forgiveness, if I believe people can really change. Those questions miss the point entirely. This story was never about what Thaddeus deserved. It was never about forgiveness in the traditional sense. It was about power, who has it, how it's used, and what happens when it shifts from one person to another. I stayed because leaving would have meant giving up the most fascinating experiment of my life, transforming a marriage built on dominance into one built on mutual dependence, turning a relationship that diminished me into one that revealed my full capacity. The woman who was once invisible in her own home is now the center of a life that revolves around her choices, her comfort, her approval. The woman who once had no voice in major decisions now has veto power over everything that affects her future. That's not forgiveness. That's victory. If you've ever felt powerless in your own life, drop a comment and tell me about it. Your story matters. The most beautiful part of this transformation is that I didn't have to destroy him to save myself. I didn't have to become cruel to stop being a victim. I simply had to become strategic, patient, and willing to use the opportunities that life presented. Some people might say I manipulated him. I prefer to think I educated him. I taught him what it feels like to live with uncertainty, to depend on someone else's goodwill, to have your comfort and security rest in another person's hands. I taught him empathy the only way someone like him could learn it, by experiencing firsthand what he had put me through for 15 years. And in teaching him, I learned something about myself that I never could have discovered any other way. I am far stronger, far smarter, and far more capable of strategic thinking than I ever imagined. The accident didn't just break Thaddeus's back. It broke open a version of myself that had been buried under years of being told I was weak, dependent, and unremarkable. But here's the question I want to leave you with. When someone shows you who they really are, do you believe them? Or do you wait to see who they become when their circumstances change completely? Thaddeus showed me for 15 years that he was selfish, controlling, and dismissive. But he also showed me, in his vulnerability, that he was capable of gratitude, respect, and genuine partnership. Which version was the real Thaddeus? Maybe they both were. Maybe we're all multiple people, and which version emerges depends entirely on what the situation demands and what we're forced to learn about ourselves. I know this. The woman I am now could never have tolerated the marriage I had before. And the man Thaddeus is now would never have created the marriage we both escaped from. Sometimes the best revenge isn't hurting someone who hurt you. Sometimes it's becoming so completely yourself that their power over you simply evaporates. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that everyone has the capacity to reclaim their power, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your engagement helps me reach people who might be living their own version of this story right now. The scar on Thaddeus's back will fade over time, but it will never completely disappear. Every morning when he gets dressed, every night when he lies down, he's reminded of the night that changed everything. But I carry my own invisible scar, the mark left by years of being made to feel small. The difference is, my scar healed into something stronger. His just reminds him of how fragile strength really is. They say pride comes before a fall. For him, it came with a wreck. For me, it came with my rise. He turned his back on me once, dismissing me as unimportant, treating me like furniture in my own life. But now, his bent back will forever remind him of the wife who refused to stay broken. The woman who took his moment of greatest weakness and transformed it into her moment of greatest strength. The partner who taught him that real power isn't about control, it's about choice. And every single day, I wake up and choose to stay. Not because I have to, not because I'm trapped or afraid or dependent, but because I want to. That choice, that daily decision to remain in a relationship where I hold the power, is the sweetest victory I could have ever imagined. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. Subscribe, ring that notification bell, and I'll see you in the next video where we explore what happens when ordinary people find extraordinary strength in impossible situations. Remember, You're stronger than you know, smarter than you've been told, and more capable of changing your life than anyone has ever given you credit for, including yourself. Until next time, this is your host reminding you that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to stay powerless.